on to talk about music categories, and every year I hope you enjoy it.
It was a huge night out, and in my drunken stupor, I actually hit my groin on one of those chunky bollards. But as it turned out, it actually wasn't a bollard at all. I was sexually assaulted by Brad Drew. I know it might sound strange to say it, but if I had the choice between keeping Cameron Smith or Augusto Pinochet in power, I'd still lean with Pinochet. The trio would have to be Craig Gower, Jason Moody, and Sam Obst, because I just can't see another three players fitting in musically with Craig McLachlan and Check 1-2. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of The Voluntary Tackle, the only NRL podcast campaigning for a new NRL team in Mexico City, if for no other reason than to see a Grade 5 beheading. I'm your host, Aimon Brown, and today on the show we'll be chatting NRL expansion, player movements, and who the best sporting team has been in the last 5 years. But first, I am joined in the studio by the man spearheading a Kickstarter campaign to have a douchebag tumour removed from Ray Hadley's pituitary gland. It's Xander Risotto. Welcome to the show, mate.
Thanks, mate.
Mate, now is this accurate medical science? I don't think I've ever heard of a douchebag tumour, but you're essentially saying that this has been the cause of his abhorrent behaviour all these years?
No, it's just part of it, really. I mean, it's one aspect of it, but I figure if we get it removed, he might commentate a little bit less like radio when he's on TV.
He is the worst commentator. We were talking about this earlier today. I think we've established Ray Hadley is the worst commentator to ever broadcast the game of rugby league. For that very reason, he doesn't realise that TV is a visual medium, Xander.
No, he doesn't. It's a really painful experience watching games when he's been on Channel 9 and having him explain to you exactly where a kicker is lined up, like to the inch.
He does do that.
Yeah, and you're like, mate, we can see the fucking game.
Oh dear. Is there a chance if you did attempt this scientific operation on Mr. Hadley that he would die?
Hopefully.
Since we are removing things, castration? I think if at the same time, just two birds with one stone, what you could do...
still on Hadley? Or
yeah, still on Hadley. Yeah, I think if you're going to do the whole pituitary gland tumour thing, just lop the old balls off at the same time, grind it up to a fine powder, and then let his son snort it. Seems like a pretty fair thing for me, which I think is a very savoury note, Xander, to get tucked into our very first NRL topic.
Tucked in, I see what you did there.
Yeah, thank you very much, mate. Now, it is Latrell Mitchell. Now, apologies, listeners, if we do sound a little bit like broken records, but the saga, unfortunately, does continue. This week, Latrell Mitchell has been linked with both rugby union and more heavily with the Gold Coast Titans, Xander. Where is all this paper talk suggesting Mitchell will be in 2020? What does your gut say?
Oh, he's going to stay with the Roosters, I think, at this point.
Do you really think that'll be the case?
Yeah, at this stage, I genuinely think he's going to just play out the 2020 season with us and reassess his options, because it sounds to me, I mean, I think the papers have probably overblown it a bit, but that he's had, his many managers, all the people who are representing him, have been making these I suppose, representations to different potential suitors like Rugby Australia and others, kind of unsolicited almost. And, they just...
You think they've gone rogue?
Yeah, I think by asking for that $1 million price tag and then, stuffing things up with the Tigers, and I mean, that said, the Tigers said they withdrew their offers, but it'd still be on the table. So I don't know what that means.
Yeah, there's a lot of misdirection going on. Whether or not even Latrell Mitchell was legitimately, or his management was legitimately ever interested in the West's Tigers is actually hard to, or I guess remains to be seen. But if you think that Mitchell might be staying with the Roosters in 2020, what will that season look like? Because from what I've already read, the Roosters have been pretty clear that he may not be playing first grade if he stays. Could he be playing with Norths in 2020?
No, I don't. I mean, finally somebody News Limited copped to this, that it couldn't be substantiated, that particular rumour. I saw that in the paper today. So, I thought that was always one of those things that was put out there for headlines. Maybe it was an off-the-cuff comment out of, frustration by somebody, but I seriously doubt that Robinson would ever consider putting a representative centre of his ability into reserve grade for a full year.
I mean, that's just slanderous towards the old North Sydney Strip, mate. Mate, it would be a proud tradition for Latrell Mitchell to turn out at North Sydney Oval in front of a giant crowd of 11. It's a great ground. It has fairly cheap beer and ample parking.
Well,
so
he could play fullback there.
he could do a lot worse than play for the old Bears. But look, Xander, as a Roosters man, I'm becoming increasingly worried that he will end up at Easts. And I don't mean any disrespect to the Mitchell here. Obviously, we've earned 2 premierships with him playing at centre, and he's been very good. But as talented as he is, I think the way that all this has sort of played out in the media raises the chance of Mitchell destabilising the team, given there might be some bad blood now. Do you think there's a chance that might be the case?
I hope not. I can see where you're coming from, though. I mean, if there's a saga throughout the entire year, basically around where he's going to end up in 2021, then it is one of those distractions that you just don't need. And there was a good piece, I can't remember, it was in one of the papers the other day.
Probably written by me.
Yeah. Was it?
I mean, if it's a good piece.
Reputable publication online somewhere.
Was it written in crayon with pop-up pictures? Because that's generally how I put my prose together.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
But they talked about how the difference between the way that Tedesco's management has dealt with his contract negotiations and the fact that the Roosters had put together like a dedicated legal team to manage the fallout between his former and new managers.
Yeah, right.
And how they've kept that distraction away from him. Whereas it does feel like with Mitchell that he had his own manager shift in the middle of the year that was brought on by him and other close confidants, and it seems like that there isn't that same ability for the Roosters management to kind of play a role in trying to remove the distractions, because it is about his next upcoming contract. So
look, as you said, and I think an important part of this puzzle is the fact that one of the key attributes of this latest Sydney Roosters team has been its unity. And it's such a tight-knit unit. In fact, Nick Politis, I think, commented that this team, i.e. the 2019 grand final winning team, is the closest and tight-knit unit that he ever remembers. And obviously he's presided over a fair bit of success. So it seems to me that is a lot at risk. There's a lot at stake if Latrell Mitchell, sort of the ructions continue there between his management and other clubs. I think you almost have to make a calculated judgment there, whether or not, as talented as he is, he's going to rock the boat too much.
Yeah, and that's a call that they'll have to make. I mean, they're pretty astute management setup though, so. I don't know. I suspect that they'd find a way to make it work. They would just put structures in place and timelines to say that, look, you can do what you want around your contract, but you've got to get it done by, say, the first quarter of the year, and then no more.
Put a deadline on him.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem as though Latrell's management responds particularly well to deadlines, though, at the moment. So I think they are the fly in the ointment at the moment. The fact he has a fairly rogue management team muddying the waters. How credible do you think these linkages are to the Gold Coast Titans? Mal Meninga seems very confident. In fact, he almost seems a bit too desperate. Like when you're on a date or something and he really wants the second date, and he's almost salivating and frothing at the mouth. I think he needs a big name signing quite badly because he knows the Titans are a franchise that might fold if they don't get him. For me, I don't think he's seriously linked to that club. I don't think there's a chance he'll end up there.
Yeah, I find it hard to say. I don't know. They'd have to shift players to get space in the cap to get him anyway.
They just have to kill Ash Taylor. Yeah. Just drop an anvil on his head. That would free up $8 million.
So what is the theory then? If the Tigers aren't really if there are question marks about whether or not he was really serious about the Tigers, North Queensland are gone. The Titans aren't a real prospect. I mean, is he just playing the long game to go to Souths? Is that the thinking?
I think that could be genuinely. Well, obviously, I don't think it was all rumour that he did have ambitions to play with Souths, and his management seemed pretty keen on relocating him there. So whether or not that is the play in 2021, try to jack up the price between now and then, with always the intention of playing for the Roosters in 2020. That seems like it could be pretty credible, actually.
Yeah, right. Oh,
I mean, yeah, which is...
It's work to treat.
Yeah, but it's a poor reflection on him, isn't it? Not that it necessarily was his direct doing, but it reflects badly on him.
Yeah, I know.
And I know you love the Trill.
It's more that I think he's 22, I don't know, if I was 22, I don't think I had that great judgment back at 22. So
You're still scratching your ass and bumping into things.
that's right. I'm reticent to be too harsh when you got that many people pumping you up and had that much success. I don't want to be too rough on somebody who's come from that particular circumstance,
Well, just remember, Cooper Cronk, at the same age, he was already investing in blue chip shares. He had a portfolio that was doing quite well, particularly in Monaco. So, both sides of the fence.
And mind you, Cooper Cronk, right? It took him a long time to be recognised as a class halfback. He was only really in the last few years of his career was he really ever discussed as a sort of potential great, because throughout his career, he was always talked about in the context of the great players around him.
That's true. In fact, he took a long time to be recognised, full stop. There were times, I think, when his team was being mobbed by photographers and fans, and people would often give Cooper the camera to take photos of other players because they just assumed that he was part of the support staff. So I did feel for him very deeply in those early years.
Wasn't there also, when they got done for the salary cap breaches, I remember reading at the time... that he was he'd found out that other players were who were getting all these big double contracts were clearly more valued by the club than he was, and he was more than a little cut about it. I don't know if you remember reading that, but
I
was
love
something along those lines where he, obviously I think he was just on a base contract or something. I can't remember the details, but they didn't feel the need to do that secondary accounting for him.
I love the idea of being cut that a team didn't cheat for you. That's quite amusing.
You know what I mean, though? You find out that everyone else in the team has a second contract but you.
I love it. You mean no one else here is getting $35K a year plus meal vouchers? What I do enjoy about that is the fact that so many players there with double contracts seem to be allegedly blissfully unaware that any of that stuff was going on. It's going, well, I thought it was perfectly normal that 4 Ferraris turned up at my house every fortnight, Your Honour. Anyway, enough about Cameron Smith. We could talk about him all day. I don't want to drift too much from Latrell Mitchell because I did have a few things I wanted to finish off on here with Xander. And this was the prospect. Let's play some hypotheticals here, some thought experiments. If Latrell Mitchell does indeed get stranded without any other offers, doesn't end up going to rugby because the game doesn't exist anymore in Australia, doesn't go to the Titans because that won't exist anymore next year, he should really stop chasing apparitions. It's very bad for him. So he ends up at the Roosters, and say, for example, we decide not to play him. We put our stability first, and those rumours you talked about earlier turn out to be legitimate. What would he do for the year of 2020 if he was just sitting back and being paid by the Roosters and not playing any football? I mean, what would Latrell Mitchell do with 12 months of free time? Maybe some Jenny Craig commercials.
That's hard.
I felt like I had to have another crack at his weight because you took umbrage so much with my last crack on the last episode about Latrell's weight. I thought I'd weigh in again there with another one. But no, is there things that maybe he could check off his bucket list in 2020 instead? He could maybe do that sort of cliched thing, read 1,000 novels. That's ridiculous. Make it 100 novels. That's more realistic. Go see Nepal.
All this while playing for Norths.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's face it, playing for Norths, inverted commas, pretty easy. Turn up and smash the cutters. I mean, that's not hard. What would, in your view, Latrell do with all that spare time?
Yeah, I have a sneaking suspicion that if they were genuinely to drop him to reserve grade, he'd probably just pick up a contract in, I don't know, French rugby or the Super League or something. He'd find some other way to get out.
Yeah, right. So you think that there's no way that Latrell could be idle with his time? I mean, he'd still be on good money and he'd be not having to do much.
Well, like you say, he'd be on reasonable money. But if the plan is for him to just bide his time and then up his contract value, then if he's playing in reserve grade, it's not going to.
It's going to damage his price, is it? Yeah. Although Souths might get desperate.
Well, they did hire Wayne Bennett.
Now, there has been a lot made of this contract negotiations, Xander, in terms of the media making too much fuss of it. Now, something deeply ironic happened today, and I found it quite amusing. One, Phil Rothfield, otherwise known as Buzz Scumbag, he wrote a piece, I think it was today or yesterday.
Oh, yeah, I saw the headline.
Suggesting that this case, despite being a largely news-limited agenda, it feels like they shouldn't have been so harsh on Latrell Mitchell and his negotiations.
It's pretty funny to see this coming through the Daily Telegraph, which has had an article or three a day on the contract negotiations.
A feeding frenzy. And now he has the temerity to think that the media frenzy was not warranted. How do you feel about that?
Classic Buzz, I mean, just... There's a term for it, right? Where you abuse somebody and then talk about how terrible it is that they've been treated. I don't know what it is, but
Catfishing?
yeah,
No.
something like that.
No, gaslighting. Is it
Yeah,
gaslighting?
gaslighting's probably it.
Or has it just been a cunt?
Yeah.
It's hard to tell
Just
these
being
days, isn't
Buzz.
it? Just being Buzz Rothfield. I think we'll probably cover it. Now, we did put this out to Twitter. We asked our listeners, where will Latrell Mitchell end up in 2020? For the record, 51% said he would stay with the Roosters. Only 8% thought he'd go to rugby union. 4% thought he'd go to the Cowboys, and 37% thought that he'd go to the Gold Coast Titans, which leads us to only one conclusion. 37% of Twitter are on drugs. Welcome back to the Voluntary Tackle. Xander, the new ARL Commission Chairman, Peter V'landys. Now, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that surname correctly. I don't like it when there's a rogue apostrophe in anyone's surname. In fact, that's why I've never been involved with an O'Donoghue in my entire life. I'm not a fan of it.
I haven't seen a surname with an apostrophe that isn't an Irish O surname, to be honest.
You know what I think? I think this is a typo, and Peter's just stuck with it. I think he got something back from the fucking DMV at one point and just went, well, I guess they've typo, I'll just roll with it. In fact, that's more common than you think.
I mean, and it's not like it's, because the Irish surnames start with O, or like the Scots have Mick, but it's you say the O, where you don't say V-Landys, you get V'landys.
Yeah, exactly. Why jam it in between two consonants? Just makes no sense. But look, he's flagged plans for a second team in Brisbane. Now, this is in line with the ongoing debate as to whether the NRL should expand its teams beyond what we have at the moment. Now, given nobody is particularly fond of the Brisbane Broncos, doesn't this just double the hate?
Hate comes with success, and they'd have to be successful. The reason so many teams hate the Melbourne Storm is because they've been so bloody good, which is the reason we don't hate them so much at the Roosters, because we keep beating them.
Yeah, more recently. It's been quite
great.
fun to do, actually.
I have got to say, over the last couple of years, my hate for them has gone down massively.
Yeah, you're right. There does tend to be proportional to your team's success against that team.
That's right. So, I mean, the Broncos as well, used to hate them in the 90s because they always won. These days, I just feel sorry for them every time I see Anthony Milford.
Who you've already noted looks incessantly sleepy.
Yeah. He looks like Captain Snooze.
Or a black version.
I can't remember.
Got to clarify that. He was a white guy with a beard, so not sure how much he looks like.
I just remember the hat, really, but anyway. But no, I mean, I think a second team in Brisbane, it would need something to hate. They need to be successful to hate them.
Well, this is the interesting question now. I think on an economic scale, I think there's so many people in Brisbane who love rugby league. So that's a checkbox. A lot of people, Brisbane Broncos, arguably the most successful club in the NRL, huge amount of members. Now, I think there is an argument to suggest that there probably is room in the market for another team in Brisbane. It seems like it's probably 15 years past its due-by date that a second team could enter that one city town. But the big question, I know we've discussed this before, is would fans in Brisbane get behind a second team after being so fanatical about the Broncos for, over 30 years?
Yeah, this is the question I've always got. I mean, it's the National Rugby League, and there are two key population centres that we have no representation in Perth and Adelaide, and we're prioritising putting a second team in Brisbane, where I really don't understand and haven't seen a convincing case as to where the demographic identity rifts exist within Brisbane that you can take advantage of. Yeah. So is it South Brisbane, Central Brisbane, North? Where is that sort of like Sydney, north of the bridge, south of the bridge, East Coast versus Western suburbs? Where is that difference in identity that you can leverage to create a new team? I just don't see it.
And you made a good point before, Xander, that in Sydney it sort of naturally exists. For example, East versus West kind of hate each other. This is the old Silvertails Fibros argument. I guess being less familiar with Brisbane, I'm not speaking out of turn, but I don't know if those kind of rifts exist between Brisbane Central and South Brisbane. So the challenge would be to create a whole new identity that people in South Brisbane and even maybe south of Brisbane could get behind, and leave the Brisbane Broncos ship, which has been pretty well established.
Yeah, the only real opportunity I can see there is that there's two bids. Is that the Brisbane Brothers and the Brisbane Bombers, right? You probably just have to call them Brisbane and make their identity about something. The brothers,
the South Queensland ice addicts, because I know meth is quite rife there.
I think that's more South Melbourne, isn't it?
There too.
It's great meth.
It's
meth
all of
grown
Adelaide.
country. Yeah.
So it's ubiquitous everywhere. But if you were going to, as you said, go out on a limb and have a unique identity, embracing crystal meth could be the way.
They'd certainly be dynamic on the field. No, but I mean, the way I look
It'd
at
be
it,
unstoppable. Imagine coming up to the
for
fullback
about 3 days straight.
and the fullback pulls out the capsicum spray, can't bring him down.
mind you, they'd be gassed by finals time. You know,
Oh, that's right. Yeah. They'd be dead by then.
yeah,
They would have expired as a person.
classic March premiers.
They would be the St. George north of the border.
But getting back to what I was saying is that I think you need to make the identity about something distinct. So there's something kind of corporate about the Broncos, right? And the Bombers, I think, have that problem as an identity, is it seems to have a similar corporate feel to it. Whereas,
Can you take the listeners through the Bombers? Because I'm not as familiar. I know that's the pitch, isn't it?
Yeah.
But can you unpack that a little bit? Do you happen to know any details about what that Bombers franchise entails?
yeah, so I read up on it a while back. I read up on the two big ones, which were the two I mentioned. They've also had talks about something in Ipswich, which seems far too narrow for me.
Yeah.
But the Bombers were kind of like the slick corporate backed. I think with plenty of millionaire money and sponsorship support lined up as a bid, whilst the Brothers were, I think, a more community-based and organic grassroots setup.
Can I tell you, I'm completely not familiar with the Brisbane Brothers. I've never even heard of that. I'm quite familiar with the Bombers concept. But the Brothers, that sounds like it's a religious organisation.
Does a little, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
but I remember I read up on this because I was curious, because we've had this point about the divide in Brisbane. I mean, where do you find that new identity?
Yeah.
There was a few pieces on the Raw and on the League Unlimited about it, and the Brothers seemed to be a bid that had that kind of more organic feel, and I can see that working if you could get enough support behind it, because it would be different enough from the Broncos, right? I don't know if the Bombers have that kind of AstroTurf Western Sydney Giants feel to them.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
you're just like, we'll call them the Giants and put them out at Western Sydney. It's,
The Brothers seem so random.
Yeah, well,
I get the idea of community, but what would that emblem look like? Would it be essentially a priest molesting a small child, or I mean,
I don't think it's brothers in the religious sense. I think it's more brothers in arms. But
I see.
But
Well, okay. Well, sometimes there is arms involved in molestation.
That's
but I don't know if
true.
it's
Sometimes
entirely-
legs.
No, but okay, that's really interesting. And out of the two, which one did you find the most compelling?
yeah, well, I mean, financially, the Bombers make more sense because they've got the money behind them from what I saw. But long-term sustainability, my gut feel was actually the Brothers had more of a distinction between what in terms of what their values seem to be, right? Whereas the Bombers just seemed like Broncos Mark II.
Yeah, right. Oh, well, that's interesting. It does bring us to another question: should we be expanding at all? And if so, does it make sense to make a double edition? I would have thought that it probably would have. I don't think we'd want to be going up in singles. No one likes the concept of a competition with buys. So I'm going to put the question to you. If you could add 2 teams to the competition next year, obviously that's a bit of a pipe dream, where would you put the 2 teams?
Yeah, I've been saying this for a while, but for me it's a no-brainer. You go Perth is your first priority. The reasons are that Perth, you get a new time zone for the game. The Western Force and rugby were cancelled a couple of years ago, and it's been a massive sticking point for the rugby community over there. They're still pissed off at Rugby Australia.
Yep.
So you can leverage that anger, and the NRL, wisely been taking games out there in Origin and all the rest of it, but they need to get a side there and show that city some love. 2 million people, same size as Brisbane, similar kind of mining, town dynamics.
Yeah,
a lot of
way more bankrupt businessmen.
Yeah, this is true, but they have a lot of Eastern State immigrants, effectively.
Yeah.
Who've gone over there for work. I think it's a serious priority to have a Perth side in the competition for all of those reasons. And
well, the critics would say, Xander, and I agree with a lot of that. The critics would say, but we've tried that. We did the Western Reds. What's your postscript to that? Do you think that the Western Reds just wasn't prosecuted properly, or was it a victim of the circumstance that it was in? Obviously, it was in a time when the game was in disarray.
Yeah, it was a victim of... I mean, if you look at their crowd averages, they were doing pretty well. They just, when you actually go back and look at the history of it, the teams that were cut on some pretty arbitrary measures of club finances, attendances and success rates and things like that. And I remember somebody did the analysis a little while ago where they basically tried to recreate those standards. I think it was on the Raw, and that if you were to do that to the clubs today, all these high-profile clubs would be cut.
That's right. Yeah,
so
I think that rationalisation process was pretty unfair.
Yeah, so
I remember they kicked out Norths, and in the details it said, because you have Jason Taylor playing for you. And I thought that was pretty mean.
That was justified.
You're right. But back to Perth, I mean, I think you're quite right there. And in fact, from what my understanding of that history is that essentially it was doing okay, but someone said, let's do Melbourne instead. And a lot of the executives and the players ended up moving across to the Storm, which
that's right.
The rest is history. Yeah. They obviously went on to become quite successful.
Yeah, I mean, if they'd been able to see, the Melbourne Storm have been a great success, but it was an expensive operation. And one of the arguments that I have read against Perth is that, they're going up against the likes of the West Coast Eagles and Fremantle.
Yeah, AFL very well established there, obviously.
But, that's still a market of 2 million people that effectively has 2 winter football codes now.
Yeah.
They've got the Perth Glory in the A-League that plays over the summer, but they don't have a rugby code of any form there now. They've got that Mickey Mouse competition that Forest runs, but nobody gives a shit.
Good old Twiggy.
Yeah.
Is Twiggy a fan of league at all? Can we get funding from him, or is he really pro-union?
I don't know, to be honest. I think if the NRL were to approach him and say, look, we'll help you get mining tenements. I don't know.
Twiggy, if we decide to rape the soil for free over here, will we put a league team in? Can you oblige?
Yeah, I mean, some player. I mean, he loves his rugby. It's true, and he's at war with Rugby Australia. I think the NRL need to make a play there, though, and they probably need to approach him and say, look, you're not getting anywhere with Rugby Australia.
Yep.
They're about to lose all their money going to court over Israel Folau.
Yeah.
Put your money where it's actually going to do something and back an NRL team.
Well, it's funny, though. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like Mr. Apostrophe's on your side, Peter V'landys, because he's basically knocked the concept of a Perth side on the head anytime soon, which is a bit disappointing because I happen to agree with you. I think that seems like an obvious market at some point, fairly soon, to expand into. But I don't want to digress too much because you did have a second team you wanted to add. So please, hit us up with that.
So that's my first team. My second team is South Island, New Zealand.
Okay. Now, this is, I think, for a lot of people, a bit left field, but explain your case.
So, I mean, I've long thought that New Zealand probably long-term needs 3 professional sides. Like, I don't know, that might be a 30, 40-year prospect. But the logic there is from a whole of game standpoint, you want New Zealand to be as strong as possible. And it helps the Pacific as well by making them strong because like Australia, they have a lot of Pacifica players. But if you have a South Island team, you have a natural North-South rivalry for the Warriors that actually probably elevates their performances a little bit as well by giving them something like a yardstick locally.
Local derby.
Yeah. So I think it adds intrigue for the New Zealand competition. It adds to the player pool for the New Zealand league team and therefore the credibility of the New Zealand national side.
Now, explain that pool to me because I think a lot of critics would probably say South Island, a rugby union stronghold. Is there a really a big nursery of players in that region to tap?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think they were the... don't know the last year, but a couple of years running, the Christchurch Bulls is the name of it. They were the champions of the New Zealand Rugby League competition a few years running.
Did the Warriors not even win that?
Auckland didn't, no.
See, that's the other criticism, right? That people will say, I hear you on the economic argument, but the New Zealand Warriors still haven't turned in a consistent performance since their inception. I know they've been in a grand final or two, but by and large, they don't make the finals. Is adding a second team only going to dilute their performance?
Well, I mean, it depends on how it's... I think a lot of that isn't that they don't have the talent. I mean, they've got the bloody talent. I think it's largely the management of Auckland. And I think there's almost an argument that Auckland just aren't a good sporting city. Like the Blues, their Super Rugby team have been crap for 15 years.
Yeah.
It's all the teams who've won have been South.
And their badminton team fucking sucks.
Terrible.
Yeah, the Cherubs, the Auckland Cherubs, fucking shit.
So I have this working theory that Auckland is the problem, and that if you were to put in a South Island side based out of Christchurch, you'd have because there's a real natural dislike there already.
Yeah, right.
And I think that you have an interesting relationship immediately, and an intense desire probably in South Island to prove that New Zealand can be good at it, and that it's just that Auckland suck.
How good would it be if they end up gazumping Auckland and winning the NRL Premiership
Like,
first. Wouldn't that be amazing?
I swear to God, if you'd have put aside in Christchurch, I have every suspicion that they would win it before the Warriors.
We'll have to see what the punters think about that because we have put that question out to social. For what it's worth, I would probably have a second team in Brisbane or / South Queensland. I think there is a calling for that there. But I think you can't have that and the Gold Coast Titans at the same time. So as harsh as this sounds, I would propose a relocation of the Gold Coast Titans and abolish it from the competition in exchange for a South Queensland team. I'd also have a Perth team. I think that's got to happen. And because we want to go up in twos, it means I'm one team short now, which I would probably have the Central Coast. With a bit of...
Central Coast?
Yeah, I think I'd go the Central Coast Bears concept, which I know Greg Florimo at one stage was pitching. I think he might have changed the business model slightly. But essentially, you could also capture some of those disenfranchised North Sydney Bears fans and play a couple of games a year down at North Sydney Oval. Same colours, and you sort of get a lot of that North Sydney that now don't have a team. They feel a bit non-represented.
We'll take a minute.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the Central Coast, it is a huge nursery for players. I know that people have talked about scale being a problem, but I think if you intermingle that with the identity of the North Sydney Bears, you could have yourself a profitable franchise. So for what it's worth, those are my ideas. Are you going to punch some holes in those, or should we go on to social?
No, I actually see the argument there. It is a growth area. What there's about the same population as Canberra. What the Central Coast, about 300,000 people.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess purely from a superficial standpoint, I kind of like the idea of having Perth and Adelaide or something, in the competition first. But I think that's an immediately sustainable concept.
Yep.
Central Coast.
And I do think there's already the threat of AFL invading those areas.
Yeah,
so
right.
it's been a historical rugby league heartland. But we're already seeing the signs of that being eroded. And I think it's just a strategic measure against the AFL to make sure we consolidate what has always been a great nursery for rugby league.
So here's a question for us. So, I mean, like if we spend all of our time kind of shoring up our heartlands, putting a second side in Brisbane, a new side in Central Coast, where do we actually start? Where do we turn defense into offense, as the Americans say, and actually start making incursions into AFL heartland?
100%. I mean, that's a really legitimate point, which is why that plan would also have Perth involved. I think that would be the first step. I think you're right. You've got to play both, right? And shoring up what we do best, or shoring up our traditional markets, I think has to be a part of it. But we do also need to, without doing high-risk strategies, I think, expand into other areas as well. So I would go Perth. Adelaide might be down the track, and New Zealand. I think that what your argument there for a second team in New Zealand actually has a fair bit of merit. So I think that could be something down the track as well. We know that rugby league is pretty healthy in the region as well, and I love what they're doing in bringing in Pacific Island nations into the second and third tiers. I think that long term, we're going to have a Papua New Guinea side in the competition, hopefully. We may have Fiji, Tonga, who knows? I think there's some really exciting things on the horizon. So in terms of that expansion as well, that could well be a part of the picture.
Yeah, long term, I always wonder how it's going to look in say 30 or 40 years, where you're probably right. You would need at some point Port Moresby side if the place is developed enough and can sustain it.
Yep.
That you would want to ideally something in Port Moresby, because that is 8 million people who are nuts about the game. So if they reach a level of development that is comparable to parts of Australia, it becomes a significant market for us almost immediately.
And we've done the NRL rather has done some really good things there in accelerating that. And I think that there's a natural acceleration point because of their economy, and what we've done in terms of the player development side has been really fruitful already. I mean, look at the results they're posting in their team. You can see the standard increase in the last 5 years is off the charts.
No, it is. It's incredible. It's just a very complicated country, and it's one of the most the most
has some
low,
issues to say the least.
Well, yeah, and it's I think it's one of the lowest rates of urbanization in the world. So it is 8 million people, but it's not like you can just center it. No. It's a complex one, but I think it's a 30-40 year prospect.
We will go to the punters now, Xander. We asked, where should the NRL expand to next? For the record, a second team in Brisbane scored 48% of the vote. Perth with 38%. The Central Coast scored 14%. And I'm very sad to say this, Xander, a second team in New Zealand, 0%.
No vision.
Unfortunately, that's 0 from 76 votes. So potentially after this episode goes to where some people might feel persuaded by your argument. But for the moment, it's a no-go.
Did we have Adelaide in there at all?
We didn't. It's a max of 4 options. Yeah. So I did debate whether or not to throw Adelaide in. But yeah, I just went with those options.
I think at some point you need to have an Adelaide side in there. I mean, they're taking games there already, but yeah.
Look, and that's just the polling, mate. We also put out the question. Lamentably, no Adelaide, but from the Woody and Slugs Do League Rugby League podcast. By the way, guys, if you're not on that, give it a listen. It is good value. They're suggesting Perth and the Sunshine Coast. Tell me about the Sunshine Coast. Have you heard that pitched as an idea?
No. What's the idea? Is it? Have they elaborated on what that is?
Well, so that's from Woody and Slugs, but Darren from Newey has responded and he said, the Sunshine Coast intrigues me. Could it support a team, or would a second Brisbane team who plays half their games on the coast be better? Would need a ground upgrade, but shouldn't cost too much to make a nice boutique ground. So it wasn't so much it was more of a contribution rather than agreeing or disagreeing. I haven't heard that before, so I think we need to do a bit of research investigation on that one to find out if that's a furphy or not. Now, because this is the voluntary tackle, all of our listeners don't always have sincerity at the middle of their minds. So from Andrew Ferguson, he suggested Albury and New York. Now, we did talk about New York
is already done. That's just not in the NRL.
Well, I mean, are they ready yet for the rigours of National Rugby League in Australia?
Oh, I'm sure they could take a few Giants rejects and have a crack.
Media Watch Mario, the ever omnipresent Media Watch Mario said Marrakesh and Las Vegas. Now, he has pushed Marrakesh a lot lately. I think he might have some shares there.
For Marrakesh.
He does indeed. And Las Vegas, let's have a bit of a think about whether or not Las Vegas would work in the National Rugby League. What would they bring to the competition outside of overt corruption?
Yeah, even odds, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Would it just be a squad of 17 prostitutes? Because obviously they're known for their girly shows.
Would it just be 17 slot machines?
Maybe that's right. You know what? Genuinely, I would love to see a squad of sort of fairly effeminate croupiers take the field, because I'd want to know how the Roosters, someone like Tiki Aho, for example, what that would look like as he ploughed at full speed. Could be interesting.
Don't even know what that is, but okay.
Now, other responses we had, this was from Sir Richard Cranium. I think that's an alias. He said Christmas Island and Pyongyang, which is an interesting coupling, isn't it? Because from what I understand, they have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
It would definitely be a contrasting couple of additions to the competition.
Should they have to play each other to make it into the National Rugby League? And if so, who would win between Pyongyang and Christmas Island?
I get the feeling Pyongyang would win just because more would be at stake for the players.
That's true.
I hear when their soccer team lost at the last World Cup or the one before, like the players weren't seen by their families again or something ridiculous.
They were all hung on.
Like, I'm not even joking.
No, it's legitimately true, which is why I thought let's make light of it. Because comedy's the ultimate healer, everybody. No, but yeah, you're 100% right. As in the same in Iraq, when the Iraqi teams didn't do so well, Saddam Hussein's son used to have them routinely tortured until they learned to defend better. I'm not sure if it's a tactic that's been very successful. Certainly Michael Maguire's tried it, and it didn't work so well for South, particularly Greg Inglis's left knee didn't fare so well. Now, we had Mayan Rattison, which seems to be a play on Ryan Madison. He says, give me the Sunshine Falcons and a second Melbourne team. So he won't even respond to that. That's ridiculous.
So second
Ryan.
Melbourne team actually is something that, again, sort of intrigues me, but yeah.
Come on, that can't be legitimate, can it?
Oh, it's a city of 5 million people.
True, but there's not a single Victorian player in their team.
No, well, that's not true anymore, right? Like they have players who've come through the developmental system at this point.
From Victoria, though?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're born and bred Victorians. They're mostly from New Zealand heritage.
Have played top grade?
Yeah.
Who?
You look through. I mean, I did this a while ago.
Are we going to get Twitter fact checked, mate?
I think I did this a while ago, but yeah, if you
okay, it's probably just my ignorance.
If you Google it, you will see that they've got genuine Victorian developmental prospects.
All right, well, we'll definitely have a look at that after the show.
Twitter are probably going to correct me, but I remember looking and wondering about that previously.
Yeah, right.
But
well, then maybe the case is slightly more legitimate than I made out initially.
I wonder. I mean, if you were to do, because I think long term, you probably do need a local derby in Melbourne. Like they've been extremely successful, the Storm. But the question is, where do you put them? Do you maybe throw them in a place like Geelong, because then they would really
Geelong would be the obvious go-to, obviously, because they've got that mass, the economy of scale, and they've supported other teams as well quite successfully. This is a legitimate suggestion from Alex Hallos. who says Perth and Wellington. So he is on board with you, mate. So despite getting 0% in the polls, clearly Alex didn't vote in the poll because he thinks Wellington would be viable. Is that where you'd station the South Island team, by the way?
Well, Wellington's not in the South Island.
Oh, sorry, of course.
It's,
Can we edit this? It would be Christchurch, I'd imagine.
yeah. So I mean, Wellington was the.
It's very close, though, to be fair. It's just on the other side of the strait.
Yeah.
But I'm still fucking wrong.
it's minor point, mate. It's
Water. I mean, really.
I mean, Queensland have been using that same logic to pick their players for years. But
that's interesting. So he's going 2 North Island teams here.
Well, yeah, I mean, Wellington were the bid for a second New Zealand side, right? It was the Wellington Orcas, from memory.
Great knowledge.
But I just instinctively like the idea of Christchurch more, and that's where the teams have been taking their games. I think there's almost been a recognition that the Cake Tin, that the stadium in Wellington that they play the games out of, isn't the best fit in terms of just building an atmosphere and a support base.
Is that because they haven't greased the tray properly?
Yeah, most likely.
Yeah, baking joke.
It's just, you get it all on the voluntary tackle.
Yep.
But they used to take a lot of games there, and for a little while they're doing all right. But increasingly, all the teams who take exhibition games to other parts of New Zealand, they're taking them to Christchurch.
Yep.
So the Panthers, Manly, that they've taken.
So they obviously see a market there.
Yeah, and I think from memory they do own their own stadium in Christchurch.
Well, they did until it fell down in the last earthquake.
No. So it's a different stadium. If I understand it right, I could be wrong, but. The Crusaders have been playing out of the rugby league ground, which got repurposed after their main stadium got damaged.
Sure. Okay. Well, for the record, I'd also like to relocate Souths to the outback town of Kirakara in Western Australia's Gibson Desert, just because if I am involved in this hypothetical scenario, I'm in charge, so fuck it. Welcome back to the voluntary tackle. We're talking Melbourne Storm, and we apologise in advance. We don't enjoy doing that. But we need to talk about them, Xander, because very recently they've been named the best sporting team in Australasia over the last 5 years, beating out a number of clubs, including our very favourite Sydney Roosters. So my first question to you, mate, is this a deserved title for a team that is full of cheats?
Allegedly. Yeah, it was an interesting one. I mean, I can kind of see how you get to it if they're basing it on mostly regular season performances and attack and defense stats and all the rest of it. The Storm have had a pretty stellar, record over the past 5 seasons.
Yeah,
I find it hard to. I mean, I don't actually understand exactly what all the criteria, but I think in Super Rugby, like the Crusaders have went 3 titles in a row.
Well, they've come in at number 2, the Crusaders, and you're quite right. Because we're a podcast that does zero research, we haven't found out what that criteria is. In fact, we barely have read to the end of this news article. But there is 25 teams named, and as you've already mentioned, the Crusaders came in at 2. For the listeners' benefit, the New South Wales Breakers came in at 3. The Sydney FC came in at 4, Hurricanes in the Super Rugby 5, and then to drop down to other teams, the Richmond Tigers at number 7 in the AFL, who have been very successful lately. In the cricket, the Sheffield Shield, Victoria, and you've got the Cronulla Sharks rounding out the list at 25, which I thought was quite generous.
Now the Sharks are at 25. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think if Matt Moylan hadn't played for them, they would have been right up there.
You'd have to say some of the regular season results and generally their performance in the finals. It's, they'd have some amazing stats. I think that stat from this year where they were the most dominant team in the past 20 years until they hit the finals.
Yeah.
But
till very recently.
It was the most dominant side since St George's run of 11 or some ridiculous thing.
Yeah, right. And look, that's actually a part of my theory, Xander, relating to Cameron Smith. He seemed very deflated at the end of last year. I think it's because literally he's still shell-shocked from the idea of being unsuccessful 2 years in a row, as is the scale of success that the Melbourne Storm have had. He's just so used to it. I think he's a bit like a drug addict, except his drug is success. And he's going through major withdrawals at the moment because the Roosters keep kicking the shit out of their team, which has been part of the enjoyment for me.
I wonder if that was part of it, actually, with Cam Smith. You're right. Like, he was really... I mean, he was upset last year, but after the semi-final this year, he definitely looked pretty...
Genuinely
down,
sad, didn't he? Yeah. And, I mean, just on the Melbourne Storm itself, what do you think has made it such a successful organisation? Obviously, the likes of Craig Bellamy helps, but outside of the obvious salary cap scandal, post-2010, their club does seem to be one of those organisations that almost exercises world's best practice. A lot of clubs and people involved in other sports often find themselves looking to the Melbourne Storm as a model of how they want to run their club. For you, what has made them so successful over the last 10 years in particular?
Well, I think they're just a club that exudes high standards, right? They have extremely high standards for anybody who's going to be. They have a pretty, you can debate it with some players, but a bit of a no dickhead policy, which is always helpful.
Yeah, I've got plenty of precedents, Your Honour.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. Like in terms of players who won't buy into the culture, they're happy to, that they won't take egos. Over team men is my
and
sense.
they fuck them off pretty quick, don't they? If they do,
and it's to be respected. And I think that's what I've been pleased with the way Robinson and that have dealt with the Latrell saga, is that they haven't been willing to entertain it and pay overs. That's what you want in a club, and they spend a lot of time with the All Blacks, and the All Blacks are definitely a paragon of great culture and success across all sports. Lots of teams look to them, and they have a really close association with the Melbourne Storm. Yeah, and they have done for several years. So they all have a very internally quite humble, high standards sort of culture where no player is considered above the rest of the playing group, and no training session is ever successful enough.
And there is the funny thing that, people make these jokes all the time, but there are players who don't perform so well and go to the Melbourne Storm, and suddenly they become world beaters. And then when they're off contract and go to another club, they go back to they come back to mediocrity pretty quickly. The likes of Proctor, for example, comes to mind. Adam Blair comes to mind. There's a number of candidates that you could point to. Jason Riles, you got the best out of him down there. So obviously that speaks for the culture, doesn't it? Because if the same talent isn't performing with other clubs, then the master variable there surely is the Melbourne Storm's in team environment.
Yeah, no, absolutely it is, and you see it a lot at the moment. Team. I think the sort of corollary to that is the Auckland Warriors, right? Like, it's like teams
inversely proportional to everything successful about the Melbourne Storm. You'll find at the Warriors.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. People talk about clubs. They wouldn't be successful if they have this player or this player. Increasingly, it seems to be not about players but systems. Players are incredibly important. Yeah. Obviously, you see that with the effect that guys like Cronk had on the Roosters, but the effect that he had wasn't so much on. It wasn't really primarily on the field. It was all about culture.
Yeah. And what do you think has been the instigator of that? Is this all Craig Bellamy, or is there more to the picture down at Melbourne?
I think it's larger than Bellamy. I think Bellamy's a really critical part of it, but they had that ownership change the early part of the decade as well that sort of built on and reinforced that system.
Yeah, right. And the other thing, there have been, remember we pointed to before, players that get really good there, but if they don't, they get booted out pretty quick. Yeah. People like Ben Roberts, for example, there have been people that they've bought and I've gone, surely they can't make that work. And very occasionally they can't.
Yeah.
There was that very famous story, and somewhat humorous, when George Rose went down to the Melbourne Storm. And, of course, big George Rose, a huge character in the game. I like him a lot, actually.
Quite literally.
Yeah, exactly. Quite literally cast a giant shadow over the game. He went down there and everyone thought, wow, this could be the making of George Rose, because he'd finally have to train hard. And I think he lasted 3 weeks and he went, fuck this. And
they told him he couldn't have meat pies between every sprint session.
That's right. And pretty soon he went, I don't think rugby league's for me. So it separates the wheat from the chaff. But I think he's actually doing something better with his life at the moment. He's very good on NITV, that Over the Black Dot show. I think he's on the panel. I like George. He's a good man. But there is obviously a point where your obesity becomes a major hindrance.
Yeah, when you don't have a momentum behind you and you're breaking the line, at least.
And you're breaking wind, don't you? And there was a time in that 2013 grand final, thank goodness George Rose was playing, because Aidan Guerra ran through the biggest gap you've ever seen. And in the background, you can just see George Rose wailing like a fish with asthma.
So you're always worried when he was running at your line at full pelt after he just had a rest, because he had just that much momentum. It's pure physics, right? But when you had when you had the ball and had a player who could put a step, you would just want him to be in front of you, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Now, in their same list, the Roosters is at 8. Do you think that's a fair assessment of how the Roosters have performed over the last 5 years? Because obviously I'm outrageously prejudiced, and I thought we should have dominated 1, 2 and 3. But we've come in at 8, below the likes of the Richmond Tigers, the Hurricanes, Sydney FC. I mean, frankly, if Sydney FC attempted to take on the Roosters in a game of rugby league, I think we'd win and win well.
I think we'd beat them at fucking soccer, to be honest.
I think Tedesco would be a magnificent goalkeeper. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely. He'd be, I imagine he'd score a lot of tries too.
I think he probably would. but is that a fair assessment, or should we be higher on that list?
I kind of feel like we should be higher, actually. I mean, if the Hurricanes are there, I think they've won, one title in the past 10 years or something.
Yeah.
I think if they're higher on the list and it's just on regular season, I think if you focus it entirely on regular season, then you're kind of missing data points.
Now, we also went to Twitter here, Xander, and we asked who has been Australasia's best team over the last 5 years. It's been very tight, but the Sydney Roosters came in at 40%, Melbourne Storm at 35%, the Canterbury Crusaders clocked up 19%, and the Richmond Tigers scored a lowly 6%. And I say, suck shit. Welcome back to the Voluntary Tackle. It's time for Aimon's Thought Bubble. Following up from my magnificent idea last week, Xander, of publishing people's salaries, player salaries specifically, it was met with a lot of condemnation. In fact, I got a lot of death threats over it, mainly from a lot of the salary cap sheets in Melbourne. But this week, it's less about the players' salaries and more about some rules around the on-field play. Scrums. They've had a bit of a poor reputation the last 20 years, when particularly it hasn't been a contest for at least 20 to 25 years. And it's
now. We had a tight head in 2004.
That's right. There was that one time. But apart from that, it is a bit of a farce. My argument for actually having scrums in the game and maintaining it has always been it's a great platform for a creative team or an aggressive team to stage a set play, right? Because you get all the forwards out of the way. But it does look a bit silly when you've got the forwards and no one's pushing, and even when they do win 1 in 380 scrums, the referee goes, nah, do it again. So it's not a great look for the game. So Aimon's Thought Bubble for this week is to actually abolish scrums, but where we have scrums now at the same restart values, we have all of the forwards stand out of the play and they can't participate in the first play. So they stand behind by about 30 metres, and then the first play is done by a tap, and then only after the player gets tackled can all the forwards join both teams. How does that sound? What's going to go wrong with it? Does it seem like it's not conducive to any kind of reality whatsoever? Feel free to lay all the questions on me.
Yeah,
Bullshit.
I don't like it. I'm not going to lie. I don't like the idea.
What are your immediate criticisms?
I mean, I think visually it looks just as silly as as having the scrums, being not contested. If anything, it probably looks even more silly because you've got half the team. I mean, it's one of those things in years to come, if you were to do it, people would be like, why the hell are half the team just standing 30 vs 1?
Okay, can I have a right to object? Okay, what if instead have them at the dead ball line in 3-legged races? You you had to do it the old athletics
turning
carnivals.
Rugby league into Bloons ball.
Futurama reference. Yeah. I loved it. But yeah, no, pretend. They always say we're trying to bring the little guys into the game, and that means tiring the forwards out. Yeah. Maybe the forwards need to do 3 laps of the oval before they can rejoin, and then they come on and they're buggered, and there's a lot more space in the game.
So I think there is a genuine discussion to be had about what to do with the scrums, but I don't think this is a solution.
All right, well, let's put mine in the trash can for now, although we'll let the listeners decide ultimately. But if you had a solution to the scrums at the moment to make sure that they didn't look as farcical as they do at the moment, what would you propose?
I hate to say it, but I actually think I'd like to see them be able to push.
To contest. Yeah. I know, it seems like a pretty simple answer, doesn't it?
I know that this has just been the direction the game's gone in, but if they've been willing to re-examine the strip rule, and allow that contest back into the tackle, I don't see there being a great harm in just you don't want to turn it into a rugby scrum where You've basically got reset after reset, but you allow...
That's the fear, isn't it? I think that's the fear for a lot of NRL fans, is that they like the crispness and the cleanness of the way that the game is contested. Maybe if they saw it potentially descend into rugby-esque scrums, that'd be bad for everyone.
Yeah, but I mean, they pack them at a higher angle anyway. You know, I mean, in rugby, you're basically at a 45-degree angle.
Yeah, they're pretty much putting their nipples on the ground, aren't they?
I mean, it's a very visually different thing, and the kind of body shape you need to set those is just very different. Like, you need to be quite specialized. Rugby league isn't going to go down that path, so I don't think it's ever going to get that messy.
Yeah,
like I feel like maybe you just bring in a rule where you get 2 resets, and if it goes more than that, you just get a quick tap and that's it.
Yeah, right. Well, what's the argument against just having a quick tap?
Well, maybe that's the simplest solution. The argument against it is that you don't have that opportunity for all the forwards to be locked up. But to be honest,
it doesn't get used that much
anyway.
It doesn't,
does it?
But I actually don't think. I think that's a failure of club tactics rather than the system. I think most clubs are missing a trick, actually. I don't think there's enough creative play produced from the scrum. It's a perfect opportunity. And it seems at the moment we're going through a phase of high structure and people aren't willing to risk losing possession or do anything particularly creative. It actually is one of my pet hates to just see the line set out and then there's one pass and someone just hits it up.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, you used to see a lot more of it. Like Tim Sheens was famous for pioneering a lot of really interesting scrum plays where they'd split up the middle and do all kinds of funky maneuvers off them, and I think they were really great to watch.
Yeah,
and
even the old chestnut, the kick off the scrum. If you've got a scrum deep in your own half and you have a flyer in your team, just punting it downfield and let the running race proceed. I mean, I've seen plenty of tries scored off that back in the day.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's probably one of those things where you want to keep it in the game just for when the trend runs its course and goes around to be able to. And maybe you just structure the rules in a way. I don't know what you do to try and make them more, to increase the incentives to do, things with them. But I don't know. Maybe you force the defensive side to have the fullback in the line or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. So just to recap, you're not a big fan of having all the forwards do an urban athlon.
No.
Well, Xander, we're getting to the pointy end of the show and we're doing our 2020 predictions where we go through each show and give our 2 cents on how we think teams will perform in 2020. And for this show, we're talking about the St. George Illawarra Dragons. Now, it must be said they had a pretty dismal year in 2019, Xander. They faded in the second half of the season to second last. So on this episode, we're going to go and take a look at their chances. Mary McGregor, it must be said, recently returned from a trip from the United States to gather some intel and some ideas as to how they can improve their performance next year. During the week-long tour, he apparently visited the New York Giants, the Brooklyn Nets, the US Tennis Association's Flushing Meadow headquarters, as well as attending NFL, NBA and NHL matches. And get this, he also met with representatives from the United Nations. So Mary seems pretty serious about 2020, Xander. He met with the fucking UN. Can this help the Dragons?
What was the topic of discussion at the UN?
I think he was trying to solve the dispute between Somalia and Ethiopia because there's obviously rising tensions.
Wasn't able to resolve the situation with Jack DeBell, and I don't know how he's going to go with Israel Palestine. It's just
I'm not exactly sure what the topic of conversation was with the United Nations, but good on him for trying to think outside of the box. I mean, look, he's done a number of things at the end of last season, and I think a lot of people probably view 2020 as Paul McGregor's last shot at it. I think if it becomes a blunder of a season, will find he might not even see the season out. I think he'll be knifed before then. So the St. George Illawarra management are sort of right over the top of him on this. So at the end of this last season, he appointed Phil Gas Gould to do a full review, to help conduct a full review of what happened during the season. Now, it must be
I've always find that really funny, bringing someone on to do a review of what happened during the season, like you weren't there watching it.
I know. So this is kind of like extra set of eyes in case you've missed something and maybe the outsider's perspective might pick something up. But you're right. I think they do a review, a comprehensive one. At the end of the 3 weeks, they'd go, "Yeah, mate, your side was actually pretty shit last year. That's what went wrong." So whether or not that was what was said between Phil Gould and Paul McGregor, I don't know. But I can tell you they're actually very good friends. So I think there's a bit of a conflict of interest there. I think if you're going to get an objective third party in, maybe don't choose someone that you drink with pretty regularly, because I think McGregor's chosen him because he thinks Gus won't fire him. I'm pretty sure that's the reason he's been selected.
It always, I mean, it makes me think of, like a company that has been involved in some massive public fuck up where they've lost huge shareholder value, bringing in the consultants to do a review of their business. And of course, they're paying the consultants, so they've laid the tracks down for them so they know where they're going to go.
Yeah, exactly.
And it just, you know what I mean? Like they bring someone in so they have somewhere to point where there's when they've got their conclusion that it's not theirs.
Yeah, exactly. So these are the answers we want. Can you go and get them and present them back to me?
Look, it's a third party.
That's right. This isn't my own review. I've instructed a third person to give me my own opinions. So it does seem to be a conflict of interest. But I think to just give a bit of a postmortem on 2019, for you, where do you think the Dragons went wrong last year? What did you think their major weaknesses were?
I mean,
where do you start?
You probably start at DeBellin and Widdop.
Yeah, I think they're huge factors. So Jack DeBellin, for the listeners that don't know, obviously encountered some legal issues last year, and the St George Dragons, or the St George Illawarra Dragons, Illawarra, took the unusual step, I think, of standing him down, but having him embedded in the playing group the whole time. And I think
trained with them every week.
Trained with them, and I think he was there as a shadow the whole time. I think with some expectancy that he would be cleared to play, but of course that didn't happen, and he's been committed to stand trial, and it kind of backfired. So I think over time,
just a little,
so I think Jack DeBellin was there with the camp, and he kind of depressed the entire squad. So that was, I think, a fairly sizable strategic misstep on behalf of McGregor to do that. I think it might have been better to support him privately and not have him maybe embedded so much with the team. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's probably one of those things where hindsight's 20/20, but everything I've read about it, it sounds like it was a bit of a distraction, and it was a bit probably almost awkward.
Yeah.
You got in there every week. What is the point of it apart from keeping him fit? If you know that they've got this no fault stand down rule,
although that came in after the fact, didn't it? I think they brought it in because of DeBellin.
Yeah, they did, but they still had him training up until the back end of the season. They that no fault stand down rule was there for a long time after they decided to keep him around.
Yeah, that's very true. And you alluded to something earlier as well, Xander, and that was Gareth Widdop. Now, he's moved on from the club now, but a man plagued with injuries, who is a very good player, mind you, but so much of their attacking prowess rested on his, excuse the pun, shoulders, very feebled shoulders, it would appear, because I think he did a number of injuries throughout the season, and I think they really missed him.
Yeah, well, he did his shoulder, I think, in like round 4 or something, and he was considered to be out for the season. He managed to come back.
And then did it again.
Yeah, and then did it again.
And, the worst part with him is that he seems to be doing those injuries in the most innocuous fashion possible. He just falls on the ball and looks like he's in blinding pain. So maybe the NRL's not for him. He should go off and do 10-pin bowling or something.
It's a shame, but it's exactly what happened to Kieran Foran in that tackle for the Kiwis.
Yeah.
Like, a really innocuous thing, and you're like, yeah, there's something deeper and structural there.
Yeah, 100%. His hamstrings must be made of tissue paper. It's ridiculous. Another factor in St George Illawarra's performance last year, I think, Xander, was the up and down confidence of Ben Hunt. To me, I think needs a fairly solid halves partner who can steer the team around the park. I don't think he has the greatest record when all of that responsibility is his. I think he's better when he sort of augments someone who does all the steering. So if St George Illawarra can get someone in the halves next year who can take the pressure off Hunt and let Ben Hunt be Ben Hunt, they might be in much better stead. Where do you see Ben Hunt fitting in with the Dragons? Do you think he's been a good buy, or do you think they're going to keep him?
I'm not Ben Hunt's biggest fan. I just think,
Yeah.
I don't think he's. Yeah, I think you're right. I think he's probably a player that isn't bad as a second fiddle to a dominant half, but he isn't. Yeah, he isn't who you want starting and running your show.
Now, are you holding the 2015 grand final against him here? Now, just because every time a restart happens, he looks like he's trying to catch a falling baby, isn't a reason to hold his whole career against him. Just making sure you're not carrying that prejudice with you.
I wasn't carrying. If it was a prejudice, it would indicate that I was in support of the Broncos. I was not.
Yeah, very true. You punched a hole in my attack there. So looking at the positives for the Dragons next year, they've recently looked like they've locked up the young gun Zach Lomax, and they've managed to secure the signature of Isaac Luke. Now, that's an interesting decision. Isaac Luke, in the twilight of his career now, last couple of seasons, haven't been particularly successful for him compared to his normal form. Left the Warriors, and it looks as though they're going to play him off the bench behind Cameron McInnes. Now, interesting to sign a hooker, when your hooker's probably your best player last year in Cameron McInnes. What do you make of that signing?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The only thing I can think is maybe that he was, they got him on a cheap deal and they thought they could just use a bit more depth there, and he might maybe. I mean, how old is McInnes? He's not.
No, McInnes is fairly young, so there's a big future ahead of him.
So maybe it's also just a matter of having a mature, sort of calm set of hands for. Yeah. Because he's a premiership winner. He's been around for a while. Bring him in. He can play that role, sort of like, say, Jake Friend with Verrills at the Roosters.
Yeah, and as you said, they probably got him for a song. What do you reckon they've paid for him?
Yeah, I'd be interested to know. But
I think they've paid him in McDonald's vouchers. I don't think they've paid actual Australian currency for Isaac Luke.
It's all you need to be convinced to come back to Australia after a stint with the Warriors.
Yeah, and this is how you know that it might not be part of their key strategy, because people found out about it through Isaac Luke's Instagram. So I think the Dragons didn't even announce it, and everyone went, "Oh, looks like, unless Luke's joking, he's coming to St George." So that did seem a little bit unusual. So I'm assuming they haven't probably forked out a lot of money for him. Trent Merrin, one of St George Illawarra's favourite sons, looks as though he might be returning from the Super League, and everyone thought he should retire 5 years ago, and now everyone seems a little bit excited that Merrin might be coming back now. Is he a bit too much of a geriatric to have any impact on St George next year? I mean, I quite like the guy, but I liked him in 1998.
Yeah, when we were looking at this before, I could barely remember the last time I saw him play, and I'd forgotten that he went to the Super League.
Yeah, he was in black and white the last time I saw him. It was he was being narrated by a guy who was going, "Take that, Mr. Hitler." It had that voice, so it was very old. It was one of those old archives.
Maybe there's part of Mary's grand plan in his world tour. He saw something that none of us have seen in the Super League.
Osteoporosis. Yeah. Now, the last little piece of the puzzle before we close out the show is the young Tristan Saylor. Now, this was something interesting. I didn't know this before today, actually, because for me, Tristan Saylor is a real prospect for St George Illawarra. Debuted against the Roosters in a flogging, but that wasn't his fault. He actually played really well, and I thought showed great signs in the back end of last year. He's played a bit of fullback, played a bit of centre wing, potentially could move into the halves at some point. But interestingly, St George Illawarra haven't signed him yet. He's unsigned for next year. It seems a bit of an unusual one. I think they'd want to lock him up.
Yeah, I was really surprised when I heard that they hadn't signed him, given particularly that, Big Del is probably become the most vocal Big Red V supporter out there.
Oh, yeah, hasn't he? What?
So, I mean, you'd think that just for the branding, you'd want to lock him up pretty quickly.
Is Wendell doing that just because he wants to be sponsored by St George Bank or something? It feels like there's some financial incentive in there for him.
I think it's just Del being Del, which
I'm okay
part
with.
of his charm, I reckon.
Yeah, no, totally. I love the fact he refers to himself in the third person constantly. That has endeared him to my heart, no doubt about that. And do you know what else endeared him to my heart? The fact he went on The Masked Singer and wasn't the worst singer on the show.
Yeah, that's right.
And do you know who the worst singer on the show was? An actual country singer called Adam Brand, who I've never heard of, who was fucking shit. And before you all react, yes, I have watched a bit of The Masked Singer, and I should be ashamed of myself. Now, we're going to go to social media here, Xander, because we also put out a question regarding how the Dragons will perform next year. And we said, will it be a huge improvement, a slight improvement, much the same as 2019, or they will be diabolical? And the winner of that, can you guess?
I'm going to go with diabolical.
That was in second place with 34%. Most of the punters at 41% thought it would be much the same. So there's not a huge amount of optimism from the Twitter sphere regarding St George Illawarra next year. And I can't really blame them unless, of course, Phil Gus Gould has done something magical in the review.
Well, it's worked out for Penrith.
Well, that's it for another episode of The Voluntary Tackle. Please follow the show on Twitter. We can be found at the handle @VoluntaryTackle. And also rate and comment on the podcast on iTunes if you feel like it. You don't want to see us fall into the wayside of history like the career of Matt Nable. So please do that. That'd be fantastic. Also, keep an eye out for a few more Legends of League interviews. We have a few more in store for you. And if you haven't checked it out yet, we recently had an amazing chat with Parramatta Eels legend Brett Kenny. So get involved if you haven't already. That's on the feed. Also, we'd like to put a big shout out to our mates over at Sports Best Friends, a fellow rugby league potty. Get on board if you haven't, and you just need more rugby league in your life. And for those wanting to contribute to the league community, you can support the Rugby League Project at a special Patreon site. That is www.patreon.com/RL Project. That's all from us. So until next time, just do what disgraced comedian Bill Cosby would do and claim all the women he ever assaulted were simply in need of a good night's sleep. Bye for now. Well, Xander, it's that special time of the show in the middle of the credits, and that's where you know the best stuff is really at. And it's time for our mascot war. So on the count of 3, we're going to hurl a mascot at each other and then find out who would win in a battle royale. 1, 2, 3. Western
Blue
Reds.
Sox.
Okay, so this is interesting. This looks like a colour war of some description. So the Western Reds versus the Blue Sox.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so just to be clear, because I'm not a baseball fan, but when you say blue socks, is it literally a pair of socks that are blue, or is this referring to some kind of animal I've never heard of?
It's literally a pair of socks that are blue.
Yep.
If you've ever seen the Sydney Blue Sox mascot, it's socks that have facial expressions.
Pretty shit, isn't it? I mean, that's
It's not terribly creative, is it?
Yeah, no, you'd see better stuff on a Lowe's ad. So I'm not very happy with that.
Lowe's are their sponsor, actually.
Is that right? Well, it makes a lot of sense.
Don't know, actually.
So you've got that, but unfortunately, I've selected a mascot that doesn't come with a huge amount of ferocity either, and that's a Western Red. Now,
the Western Red...
is this the kangaroo?
It's the big red kangaroos.
Okay, fair enough. All
so
right.
they're the roid-munching kangaroos.
Fantastic.
I think you might have my number, actually. I don't know if you've seen photos of them around the internet over the last few years, but they look like fucking bodybuilders.
A lot of them are juicing,
Yeah.
I've noticed. So they're obviously hanging around with Stephen Dank. I'm not sure if he is a naturalist or not, but maybe that's where he's getting his ram semen from, because he's just hanging around in natural landscapes.
Ram semen.
I mean, it doesn't really bear thinking about, but imagine Stephen Dank trying to get the semen from the ram. You can only imagine what he needs to do. Milking a ram for its semen, I don't know. It doesn't sound like a fun time to spend your Saturday night.
He's been doing that since before he heard it was good.
He's been doing it, yeah, exactly, without the health benefit, just because he likes semen on tap. But if we go back to this, battle and try to get that image out of our minds for a few minutes, let's find out if the Blue Sox can stage a boil-over, the pair of Blue Sox against a roided red kangaroo. What would a Blue Sox need to do to win that match?
I think probably, attach themselves to the big red kangaroo's feet just to disorient it.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
Maybe have you ever seen when you put like socks on a dog or a cat?
Never done it myself, but I've always wanted to.
Well, I have a dog, and I have done that to my dog. I put socks on them
For what reason?
Well, actually, to get her to stop chewing her feet.
Okay.
So like they're kind of ones that basically just wrap around so they don't do too much damage when they get too itchy.
So she's self-harming.
Yeah.
Has she gone to a dog psychologist?
No, but we just got her some special shampoo that actually seemed to be a lot more effective.
Wow.
But the socks were the first port of call. And geez, it's funny as shit watching a dog walk around, particularly if they're a strong terrier type like ours.
Yeah.
With a pair of socks, because it's like they're on acid.
Okay, so your theory is, as a blue sock, get yourself onto a really strong, sturdy canine that could do your bidding for you, essentially hijacking a dog to fight the kangaroo?
No.
I
I was saying get yourself attached to the kangaroo's feet. They probably lose all coordination and just fall over a cliff.
Okay, would that be a draw? Because I'd assume the socks would go off the cliff with the kangaroo.
Yeah, but you could probably throw a pair of socks over the cliff of throw a pair of socks over a cliff of pretty well any height, and they'd be all right.
I think you're right. By the time it hit the sort of jagged rocks at the bottom, it would be the kangaroo with the shattered skull.